Montana, 1944. When the military transport rolled through the dusty gates of what appeared to be a makeshift prisoner compound, Dr. Hiroshi Takeda pressed his face against the small window, expecting to see barbed wire and guard towers. Instead, he saw wooden buildings that looked more like a frontier settlement than a prison. At 44, the former Imperial Navy surgeon had spent months anticipating the worst kind of captivity. He clutched his medical bag, one of the few possessions they'd allowed him to keep, wondering if he'd ever use it again. The truck stopped beside a weathered barn where several men in cowboy hats waited, their faces curious rather than hostile. One of them, a tall rancher with sun-weathered hands, stepped forward and said something that would change everything. "Doc, we've been waiting for you. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we retell the forgotten human stories of war." The first thing that struck Dr. Takeda wasn't the absence of prison cells, but the presence of children. As he stepped down from the transport truck, a small girl with pigtails ran past, chasing a chicken across the dirt road. Her mother called after her in English, then noticed the new arrivals and waved at the Japanese prisoners. The rancher who had spoken, introducing himself as Tom Mitchell, explained through a translator that this wasn't exactly a traditional POW camp. It was a farming community that had volunteered to house prisoners, and they had a problem that required a very specific kind of help. Dr. Takeda's English was limited but functional, learned during his medical training years before the war. As Tom led him toward a small building that had been converted into living quarters, the rancher gestured toward the main house, where several people sat on the porch. An elderly man was coughing violently, while a woman tried to comfort him. A young boy sat nearby, his arm in a makeshift sling that was clearly the work of someone with good intentions but no medical training. "We're 40 miles from the nearest doctor," Tom explained slowly, making sure the Japanese physician understood. "Been 3 months since Doc Henderson passed. People are hurting, and we heard you were a surgeon back in Japan." The irony wasn't lost on Dr. Takeda. He had spent the last 2 years of the war treating wounded Japanese soldiers, watching young men die from injuries he couldn't always fix with limited supplies. Now, as a prisoner in enemy territory, he was being asked to heal again. But this time, for the people his country had been fighting against. The thought should have felt strange, even wrong. Instead, as he watched the elderly man struggle to breathe and saw the worried faces of the family gathered around him, Dr. Takeda felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. That evening, as the prisoners were shown to their quarters, simple but clean rooms with actual beds and windows, Dr. Takeda sat on his bunk and opened his medical bag. His instruments were still there, carefully wrapped in cloth, just as he'd left them. The rancher had made it clear that tomorrow, if he was willing, they would show him what they were calling the clinic, a room in the community center that they'd tried to set up for basic medical care. As he held his stethoscope, Dr. Takeda realized that for the first time since his capture, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he might be able to give. The other Japanese prisoners in his group were mostly soldiers, confused and wary about their unusually comfortable accommodations. They whispered among themselves, wondering if this kindness was some kind of psychological warfare, a way to make them lower their guard before the real punishment began. But Dr. Takeda, as he drifted off to sleep that first night, found himself thinking about the coughing man and the boy with the injured arm. Tomorrow, regardless of politics or nationality, people would need healing, and perhaps, in some small way, healing them might begin to heal something in himself that the war had broken. The morning sun filtered through the windows of what the community optimistically called their clinic. Dr. Takeda surveyed the room Tom Mitchell had prepared: a few beds, some basic supplies, and medical equipment that looked like it had been collected from various sources over the years. It wasn't much compared to the naval hospital where he'd worked in Yokosuka, but it was infinitely better than the battlefield conditions he'd grown accustomed to. Tom stood beside him, clearly nervous, as if he were asking a favor rather than giving orders to a prisoner of war. "The thing is, Doc," he said, removing his hat and turning it in his hands, "we don't want to force you into anything. But Mrs. Crawford's been sick for weeks, and little Jimmy's arm isn't healing right from when he fell off his horse." Dr. Takeda nodded, his limited English sufficient to understand both the words and the underlying respect in Tom's voice. In Japan, he had been Dr. Takeda, respected surgeon, father of 2 daughters, pillar of his community. During the war, he had been a military asset, a tool for keeping soldiers fighting. But here, in this small Montana town, these people were asking him to simply be what he had always wanted to be, a healer. He gestured toward the beds and said, "Bring them. I help." The simplicity of the English didn't diminish the weight of the promise. Mrs. Crawford was the first patient, a woman in her 60s who had been suffering from what the community had diagnosed as consumption. As Dr. Takeda examined her, listening to her chest with his stethoscope, he realized she likely had pneumonia, serious but treatable with the right care. Her husband, a gruff rancher named Bill, stood in the corner watching every move the Japanese doctor made. The tension was palpable. Bill had lost a nephew in the Pacific, and having an enemy soldier treat his wife felt like swallowing glass. But as Dr. Takeda gently helped Mrs. Crawford sit up, adjusting her position to help her breathe more easily, and as he explained in his careful English that she needed rest, fluids, and specific positioning to drain her lungs, Bill's hostility slowly transformed into grudging respect. The second patient was 8-year-old Jimmy, the boy with the poorly healed arm. Dr. Takeda examined the limb carefully, his practiced hands gentle despite the language barrier. The fracture had been set incorrectly and was healing at an angle that would leave the boy partially disabled. In broken English, supplemented by drawings on paper, Dr. Takeda explained to Jimmy's parents that the arm would need to be rebroken and reset. A painful procedure, but one that would give the boy full use of his limb. The parents exchanged worried glances. This Japanese prisoner was suggesting they trust him to deliberately break their son's arm. The decision they made would become the talk of the town for weeks. They said yes. The procedure took place that afternoon, with Tom Mitchell and 2 other ranchers present as witnesses. Dr. Takeda worked with the same precision and care he had shown in his naval hospital, using a combination of pressure points and what pain medication they had available to minimize Jimmy's discomfort. As he carefully realigned the bones and applied a proper splint, something remarkable happened. The adults in the room stopped seeing a Japanese enemy and started seeing a skilled physician doing everything in his power to help a child. When Jimmy's pain subsided and Dr. Takeda showed him how to move his fingers to maintain circulation, the boy looked up at the doctor and said, "Thank you, mister." In that moment, nationalism and war seemed very far away. That evening, as word spread through the community about the successful treatments, Dr. Takeda sat on the porch of his quarters and watched the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Other prisoners approached him with questions, some expressing concern that he was collaborating with the enemy. But Dr. Takeda explained something that he was only beginning to understand himself. "I am not helping Americans or Japanese. I am helping sick people. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have borders." As he spoke, he realized that for the first time in months he felt like himself again. Not a prisoner, not a defeated enemy, but simply a doctor doing what doctors do. Now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories travel. 2 weeks into his unofficial medical practice, Dr. Takeda had treated everything from infected cuts to a difficult childbirth. The small clinic had become the heart of the community, and people traveled from neighboring ranches to seek his care. What amazed him most wasn't just the trust these former enemies were placing in him, but how naturally that trust had developed. Mrs. Crawford was not only recovering from her pneumonia, but had started bringing him fresh-baked bread, insisting through gestures and broken phrases that he was too skinny. Jimmy's arm was healing perfectly, and the boy had appointed himself as the doctor's unofficial English tutor, teaching him cowboy terms and local expressions with the patience only an 8-year-old could muster. The transformation in the community's attitude toward all the Japanese prisoners was gradual but unmistakable. What had started as suspicious tolerance had evolved into something approaching acceptance, largely because of the respect people felt for their volunteer doctor. Tom Mitchell had begun involving the other prisoners in ranch work, paying them small wages and treating them more like hired hands than captives. The local pastor, Reverend Williams, had even invited Dr. Takeda to attend Sunday services, though the doctor politely explained that he practiced Buddhism. "Well," the Reverend had replied with a smile, "seems to me you practice something pretty close to what Jesus preached, healing the sick and caring for others. You're welcome any time." Doctor, Takeda's biggest challenge came when Sarah Henderson, the teenage daughter of the town's previous doctor, returned from nursing school back east. She had expected to find her father's practice closed and the community struggling without medical care. Instead, she discovered that a Japanese prisoner of war had taken over her father's role. The initial confrontation was tense. Sarah had lost her boyfriend at Pearl Harbor and couldn't understand how everyone was treating the enemy doctor like some kind of hero. "He's probably gathering intelligence," she told Tom Mitchell, "using medical care as a cover for espionage." Tom's response surprised her. "Sarah, honey, if gathering intelligence means staying up all night with old Pete when he had that heart episode, then I reckon we're all spies." The turning point came when Sarah herself fell ill with appendicitis. The nearest hospital was over 100 miles away, and the mountain roads were washed out from spring rains. Dr. Takeda assessed her condition and realized that without immediate surgery, she would die. He had performed hundreds of appendectomies, but never under these circumstances, without a proper operating room, with minimal equipment, and on someone who considered him an enemy. When he explained the situation to Tom and Sarah's mother, the gravity of the moment was lost on no one. They were being asked to trust their daughter's life to a man they had been taught to hate. The surgery took place on the kitchen table of the main house, sterilized as best they could manage. Dr. Takeda worked by lamplight with Tom and Mrs. Henderson assisting, following his careful instructions. As he made the precise incisions and located the inflamed appendix, his hands were steady despite the enormous pressure. This wasn't just a medical procedure, it was a test of everything the community had come to believe about this quiet Japanese doctor. When he successfully removed the appendix and began closing the incision, Sarah's mother began to cry. Not from fear, but from relief and a profound sense of gratitude that transcended any political boundaries. Sarah's recovery was swift and complete. As she regained her strength, she found herself in long conversations with Dr. Takeda about medicine, about loss, and about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. She learned that he had daughters back in Japan, that he worried about them constantly, and that healing people was the only way he could make sense of a world gone mad with war. In return, she shared stories about her father's practice, about growing up in this small Montana community, and about how the war had touched every family. Their friendship became a symbol for the entire town, proof that understanding could grow even from the deepest mistrust. By month's end, Dr. Takeda had become such an integral part of the community that when official word came that the prisoners might be transferred to a larger facility, Tom Mitchell and several other ranchers petitioned the authorities to let them stay. The petition, signed by over 50 community members, stated simply, "Dr. Takeda has saved lives and become family. We request permission to keep our doctor." It was an unprecedented request, and one that would test the boundaries between wartime policy and human compassion. Spring turned to summer, and Dr. Takeda's clinic had evolved into something no one had anticipated when the Japanese prisoners first arrived. The converted room now boasted donated medical equipment from 3 counties, a small pharmacy stocked by contributions from neighboring towns, and even a hand-painted sign that read Dr. Takeda's Clinic in both English and Japanese characters that Jimmy had carefully copied from a book. The most remarkable addition was Sarah Henderson, who had decided to postpone her plans to work at a big city hospital and instead serve as the clinic's nurse. Their partnership bridged more than just language barriers. It represented a collaboration between former enemies that neither had thought possible. The summer brought new challenges that tested both Dr. Takeda's medical skills and the community's faith in their unusual doctor. A polio outbreak in a neighboring town sent dozens of families seeking his help, as word had spread throughout the region about the Japanese physician who had saved Sarah Henderson's life. Dr. Takeda worked 18-hour days, treating children who arrived weak and frightened, their parents desperate for any hope. He set up isolation areas, implemented quarantine procedures, and worked with Sarah to provide the kind of comprehensive care that larger hospitals were struggling to deliver. When 3 children made full recoveries under his treatment, the regional newspapers began reporting on the miracle doctor in rural Montana. The attention brought unexpected visitors. Military officials arrived to investigate how a prisoner of war had been allowed such freedom and responsibility. Dr. Takeda prepared himself for transfer or punishment, but Tom Mitchell and the community had prepared too. They presented the officials with a detailed log of every life saved, every successful treatment, and every family helped by their volunteer doctor. Mrs. Crawford, now fully recovered, spoke passionately about how Dr. Takeda had given her grandchildren their grandmother back. Bill Crawford, the rancher who had initially distrusted the Japanese doctor, stood up and said, "This man has done more for our community than most folks born here. If you take him away, you're not punishing a prisoner, you're punishing all of us." The military review led to an unprecedented decision. Dr. Takeda and the other Japanese prisoners would be allowed to remain in the community under a special work program, with the understanding that they were contributing essential services to an underserved area. The doctor's status changed from prisoner of war to supervised civilian contributor, a designation created specifically for their situation. This change brought new freedoms. Dr. Takeda could now travel to neighboring towns to treat patients, though always with an escort. More importantly, it brought the possibility of correspondence with his family in Japan, the first communication he would have with his daughters in over 2 years. The first letter from home arrived on a day when Dr. Takeda was treating a rancher's broken leg. Sarah noticed how his hands shook as he read the familiar Japanese characters, and how tears fell onto the page as he learned that his daughters were safe and well, living with their grandparents in a village that had been spared from bombing. The letter also contained devastating news. His wife had died in an air raid 6 months earlier, a fact that the Japanese authorities had never communicated to him as a prisoner. Sarah found him that evening sitting by the creek behind the clinic, staring at the water and holding the letter. When she sat beside him, he simply said, "She is gone. I could not save her." For the first time since arriving in Montana, the healer needed healing himself. The community rallied around their doctor in his grief. Mrs. Crawford brought meals every day for a week. Jimmy drew pictures to cheer him up. Tom Mitchell sat with him on long evenings, sharing stories about his own losses during the war. Reverend Williams offered prayers in both English and Japanese phrases he had learned specifically for the occasion. Dr. Takeda realized that these people who had started as his captors had become something he hadn't expected to find again: family. When he finally wrote back to his daughters, he told them about the strange place where their father had learned to heal not just bodies, but the wounds that war leaves on the human spirit. As summer ended and autumn painted the Montana landscape in brilliant colors, Dr. Takeda established what would become his most lasting legacy, a medical training program for the community. He began teaching Sarah advanced surgical techniques, trained several ranchers in emergency medical procedures, and established protocols for handling everything from childbirth to heart attacks. His goal was to ensure that when the war ended and he eventually returned to Japan, this community would never again be without medical care. It was a gift born from gratitude, and it represented something beautiful, an enemy teaching his captors how to save lives long after he was gone. As 1945 dawned, news of the war's changing tide reached even remote Montana. Dr. Takeda continued his work with a quiet dedication that had become legendary throughout the region. But everyone knew that eventually decisions would be made about his future that were beyond the community's control. The clinic had grown into a small hospital, complete with an operating room that met regional standards and a staff of local volunteers trained in medical procedures that would have been unimaginable before the Japanese doctor's arrival. Sarah Henderson had become skilled enough to perform appendectomies herself, and 3 ranchers could handle emergency procedures that previously would have required a 100-mile journey to the nearest hospital. The end came not with military orders or bureaucratic decisions, but with a choice. In August 1945, after Japan's surrender, Dr. Takeda was given options that few prisoners of war had ever received. He could return to Japan immediately, relocate to another part of America as a civilian, or remain in Montana under a special residency program. The community had petitioned the authorities to allow him to stay permanently, offering to sponsor him as an immigrant and guarantee his employment at their hospital. Tom Mitchell had even offered to deed him land where he could build a proper home and perhaps someday bring his daughters to America. The decision tormented Dr. Takeda for weeks. His daughters needed him in Japan, where the country was struggling to rebuild and trained doctors were desperately needed. But Montana had become home in ways he never expected, and these people had shown him that healing could extend far beyond medicine. The choice was made easier by a letter from his eldest daughter, now 17, who wrote that she wanted to study medicine like her father. "If America taught you to heal hearts as well as bodies," she wrote, "then perhaps I should come there to learn too." The possibility of bringing his daughters to Montana, of building a life in this place that had given him back his purpose, began to seem not just possible, but right. Dr. Takeda chose to stay, becoming the first Japanese immigrant in the region's history and the town's first permanent physician in nearly a year. The legal process was complicated, requiring congressional approval and extensive documentation, but the community's support never wavered. When the paperwork was finally completed in late 1946, the town threw a celebration that combined American traditions with Japanese customs that Dr. Takeda taught them. Children who had learned to bow properly alongside their handshakes, adults who understood that removing shoes showed respect, and families who had discovered that honoring ancestors was universal, all gathered to welcome their doctor not as a former enemy, but as a neighbor who had chosen to make their home his home. The Takeda daughters arrived in 1947, young women who spoke no English, but who quickly learned that smiles and medical knowledge were universal languages. The elder daughter, Yuki, enrolled in Sarah Henderson's nursing program and eventually became a doctor herself. The younger Hana discovered a talent for teaching and became the town's schoolmistress, introducing local children to Japanese art and culture while learning American history and literature. The family that war had scattered was reunited in the most unlikely place, among people who had every reason to remain enemies, but chose instead to become family. Years later, when historians came to document the unusual story of the Japanese POW, who became a small town's beloved doctor, they found something remarkable. Dr. Takeda had kept detailed journals of his time in Montana, recording not just medical cases, but observations about forgiveness, healing, and the possibility of finding home in the most unexpected places. His writings became part of university studies on wartime reconciliation and post-conflict healing. But more importantly, they preserved the story of how a community chose compassion over hatred, and how one man's dedication to healing transformed not just individual patients, but an entire town's understanding of what it means to be human. The clinic that began as a converted room became a regional medical center. The doctor who arrived as a prisoner became a beloved patriarch. The community that accepted enemy soldiers became a model for post-war integration. And in a small Montana town, generations of children grew up learning that sometimes the best medicine for the wounds of war is simply choosing to heal rather than hate. Dr. Takeda worked in his clinic until he was 81, training dozens of medical professionals and treating thousands of patients. When he finally retired, the town renamed the medical center in his honor, not as recognition of extraordinary service, but as acknowledgement of an ordinary man who chose to do extraordinary good when given the chance. The last entry in Dr. Takeda's journal, written shortly before his death in 1978, read simply, "I came here expecting to be punished for war. Instead, I learned that healing has no nationality, that compassion recognizes no borders, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to help rather than harm. Montana gave me back my purpose. These people gave me back my faith in humanity, and in return, I gave them what every doctor hopes to give, a chance to live without fear, knowing that someone is always ready to heal." Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most, because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy. Montana, 2024, 80 years later. The Takeda Medical Center stands as a gleaming testament to an unlikely friendship forged in the crucible of war. What began as a converted room in a community center has evolved into a state-of-the-art regional hospital serving 3 counties, complete with specialized cardiac and pediatric wings. Above the main entrance, carved in both English and Japanese, are the words Dr. Hiroshi Takeda wrote in his final journal entry, "Healing has no nationality, compassion recognizes no borders." Dr. Sarah Takeda Henderson, now 97, and the hospital's director emeritus, still remembers the day her appendix nearly killed her and how an enemy prisoner became her mentor, colleague, and eventually like a father to her. She kept her maiden name hyphenated with Takeda to honor the man who taught her that medicine was about more than technique. It was about seeing the humanity in every patient. "He saved my life twice," she often tells medical students. Once on that kitchen table in 1944, and again when he taught me that healing begins with compassion. The annual Takeda Memorial Lecture draws physicians from across the globe to this small Montana town. This year's speaker, Dr. Kenji Takeda, Hiroshi's great-grandson and chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins, shared stories passed down through 4 generations about his ancestor who chose healing over hatred. "My great-grandfather used to say that every patient who trusted him was teaching him something about forgiveness." Dr. Kenji explained to an audience that included descendants of the original ranchers who had welcomed the Japanese prisoners. He never forgot that his first patients were people who had every reason to hate him, but chose instead to let him help. The museum adjacent to the medical center houses Dr. Takeda's original medical bag, the one he clutched during that first truck ride, expecting imprisonment, but finding purpose instead. Visitors can read excerpts from his journals, translated into 17 languages, where he documented not just medical cases, but philosophical reflections on redemption and second chances. One passage, frequently quoted in medical schools worldwide, reads, "I thought the war had ended my ability to heal. Instead, it brought me to the place where I would do my most important healing, not just of bodies, but of the divisions between human hearts. The Takeda Fellowship, established in 1980, brings young doctors from former enemy nations to work together in underserved communities worldwide. Fellows spend 2 years learning not just advanced medical techniques, but studying the history of how their mentoring hospital was born from reconciliation rather than retribution. The program has placed over 2,000 physicians in communities that needed healing, carrying forward Dr. Takeda's belief that medicine could bridge any divide. Jimmy Crawford, now 88, and the last surviving patient from Dr. Takeda's first week in Montana, still lives on his family's ranch with full use of the arm the Japanese doctor saved. He served as the medical center's board chairman for 30 years and never missed the annual memorial service held on the anniversary of Dr. Takeda's arrival. "That man didn't just fix my arm," Jimmy reflects. "He fixed something in this whole community, taught us that enemies could become family if you gave them the chance." The small cemetery on the hill overlooking the medical center contains graves of the original prisoners of war who chose to stay in Montana after the war ended. Dr. Takeda's headstone, inscribed in both English and Japanese, reads simply, "Healer, teacher, friend." But the real monument to his legacy isn't carved in stone. It's in the countless lives saved by the medical professionals he trained, the communities served by the fellowship program that bears his name, and the ongoing proof that reconciliation isn't just possible, it's transformative. Mrs. Yuki Takeda Morrison, the doctor's daughter who became a physician herself, established the center's pediatric wing before her death in 2019. Her final interview, given on her 90th birthday, captured the essence of her father's philosophy. Papa always said that every child he treated was someone's most precious treasure, regardless of what uniform their father wore or what flag their country flew. He taught us that in the examination room there are no enemies, only human beings who need care. Indeed, the town that once prepared for Japanese prisoners now hosts an annual international festival of healing where medical professionals, peace activists, and families from around the world gather to celebrate what happens when compassion overcomes conflict. The festival's signature event is the reading of letters, messages from people whose lives were touched by the ripple effects of Dr. Takeda's choice to heal rather than harbor resentment. On quiet evenings, when the last patient has been seen and the medical center's halls are empty, security guards report a phenomenon that has persisted for decades. The faint sound of someone humming traditional Japanese melodies mixed with old American folk songs. Whether it's the wind through the memorial garden or something more meaningful, staff members like to think it's Dr. Takeda, still making his rounds, still watching over the healing that continues in his name. The final display in the museum is a simple glass case containing a worn cowboy hat, the one Tom Mitchell gave Dr. Takeda during his first summer in Montana. Beside it, a placard shares the hat's story and Dr. Takeda's own words about the gift. "A cowboy's hat represents protection from the elements. Tom gave me protection from something far more dangerous, the despair of believing that healing was no longer possible. Under that hat, I learned that home isn't where you're born, but where you're allowed to become who you're meant to be." Today, the Takeda Medical Center treats over 50,000 patients annually. Its staff includes descendants of the original ranchers who welcomed the prisoners, immigrants from dozens of countries, and medical professionals who chose this remote location specifically because of its history of turning enemies into family. The waiting room walls display photographs spanning 8 decades. Dr. Takeda with his first patients, wedding pictures of couples who met at the hospital, graduation photos of medical students trained in the Takeda tradition, and images of the thousands of lives saved by the institution that began with one man's decision to heal rather than hate. The story of Dr. Hiroshi Takeda proves that sometimes the most profound victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose compassion over conflict, healing over hatred, and hope over despair. In a small Montana town, a prisoner of war became a beloved physician. Enemy soldiers became trusted neighbors, and the wounds of global conflict became the foundation for generations of healing. The legacy continues, one patient at a time, one act of compassion at a time, proving that the human capacity for forgiveness and growth knows no boundaries, national, cultural, or otherwise. As visitors leave the memorial center, they pass beneath an archway bearing Dr. Takeda's most famous quote, the words that define not just his legacy, but the ongoing mission of everyone who serves in his name. We cannot choose the wars that find us, but we can choose whether to heal or harm in their aftermath. I chose to heal, and in healing others, I healed myself.